is a new day. This is a new day full of sound, light, and expectation. This day has been waiting for you. This day has been waiting especially for you, to embrace you, to guide you. This day has been waiting with open arms just for you. This is the day we have been given. Let's not waste it. Come now, and let us worship together. Welcome to UUYO, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Youngstown. We are a unique church. Our members are not bound together by a shared creed, which means you do not need to sign your name to a set of beliefs to be a member of this church. Instead, we are bound together by a commitment to our life in the here and now, and the life of our neighbors in the here and now, guided by love, compassion, and justice. There are a few announcements this morning. Thanks to Reverend Joseph and also to the generous members of our church community for ensuring that we all have a chance to connect each day throughout the week. Please check the UUYO weekly bulletin for a variety of discussion topics led by Reverend Joseph, Melissa Smith, and Gary Davenport, and for a link to connect to each of these events. Today at 3:30 p.m., please join Mystery Wallace for religious education. RE will also take place on Thursdays at noon. Don't miss the dinner party on Earth Day. On Wednesday, April 22nd from 6:30 to 7:30. Bring your dinner and or a beverage and join us for a chat. Last but not least, consider joining us for meditation led by Linda Sharp every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 11 to 12. Lindsay Sinkovich would like to point out that she has personally gained much value from sitting from this group and has much gratitude for Linda and the teachings she shares. Speaking of Linda, I would like to now invite her to share our chalice lighting. Linda, you're muted.
Hello?
You're good. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'd like to give you some thoughts on the word liberation. That is our theme for today. When the world we knew suddenly shut down and we were shuttered in, we were thrown into a strange new world and reality. Some of us had no jobs to go to, no reliable income, and we were isolated from our friends, co-workers, and sometimes even our families. Most of us began to scramble to find some ground to hold on to. This is a scary and extremely uncomfortable place to be. Our journey through life is one of peril and possibility, and sometimes both at once. When I looked at this from a Buddhist meditation perspective, I saw some similarities to what beginning meditators come up against. First, they are faced with relaxing and connecting with their bodies, minds, and hearts. Then they focus their attention on their breath. They soon become aware of all their habitual habits of thought and gently bring their minds back to the breath, our life energy. When one has successfully stabilized their mind in this way, they are suddenly free from fixed mind. It is a moment of opening up to new possibilities. And this is where the flash of enlightenment comes in. During this pandemic, we have unintentionally been freed from our fixed minds that have been conditioned to routines, schedules, consumerism, traveling, enjoying leisure, to name a few. Now, as the smoke has cleared and we can see the devastation that is left behind, we're overwhelmed by grief, death, illness, hunger, poverty. We ask, what now?
Thank you, Linda.
Wait a minute. Oh my. Hold on. But wait a minute. What else has changed in this time of chaos and confusion? Out of ashes, we saw humanity rise up. We saw creativity soar, and we saw ingenuity in action. Then we saw ordinary citizens step forward in roles that they probably never thought they could do. Our first responders fled to the sides of people in distress, risking everything to be of service to thousands of strangers. Some even gave their own lives. We saw military and engineers constructing shelters where needed, creating safe havens instead of war. Governors and health experts guiding and encouraged us through these rough waters. Scientists working around the clock to find answers to how best to contain the spread of the COVID virus. And manufacturers answering the call to make much needed supplies. So what happened? Well, I think our collective consciousness shifted from me to us. I think as people of the world, we are already starting to live our liberation. And it was within us all the time. It was within us all the time. The way forward will be difficult. I think the biggest obstacle may be that we might fall asleep. We might let some politicians and corporations crush our trust in our individual and collective abilities. Liberation is possible because we have witnessed our humanity in action, and we have seen what can be achieved with an open heart and an us mentality. I pray, let us not forget this. I light the chalice in our collective liberation.
Thank you, Linda, for sharing your message today. Please join me now in reading the covenant on your order of service. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and the help. Each month, we give to an organization that supports transformation in our community, which is at the heart of our mission. The Share the Plate Committee has decided to turn our support for our community inward to our church community at UUYO during these unprecedented, challenging times, living in a world responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. As Reverend Joseph has shared, many church members and families have already been affected by dramatic changes to their daily lives. Some individuals have lost work, resulting in economic hardships, like figuring out how to pay for bills, food, or medications. Others who are older have underlying health conditions, though they are staying safe at home, have become isolated and unable to travel to make essential trips like going grocery shopping. And all of us are stressed, anxious, and worried. But it is important to remind ourselves that we are all in this together. We need each other's love and support now more than ever. Your generous Share the Plate donations for April will go towards UUYO's Minister's Discretionary Fund so that Reverend Joseph can respond directly to members of our church family who need our support. Reverend Joseph welcomes and encourages emails and phone calls to connect. The closing words we hear each Sunday ring louder and more clearly now, more than ever. You are loved and never truly alone. We will now receive the offering that supports the life of Youngstown, the Mahoning Valley, and our wider world.
Now please join us for a few moments of silent meditation. And now for our first reading poem, I Lived in the First Century of World Wars by Muriel Rukeyser. I lived in the first century of world wars. Most mornings I would be more or less insane. The newspapers would arrive with their careless stories. The news would pour out of various devices, interrupted by attempts to sell products to the unseen. I would call my friends on other devices. They would be more or less mad for similar reasons. Slowly I would get pen and paper, make my poems for others unseen and unborn. In the day I would be reminded of those men and women, brave, setting up signals across vast distances, considering a nameless way of living, of almost unimagined values. As the lights darkened, as the lights of night brightened, we would try to imagine them, try to find each other, to construct peace, to make love, to reconcile, waking with sleeping, ourselves with each other, ourselves with ourselves. We would try by any means to reach the limit of ourselves, to reach beyond ourselves, to let go the means, to wake. I lived in the first century of these wars.
First, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Andy Crabb and the entire team for getting our virtual service up and running. It's so much appreciated. Also, I want to thank all of you for showing up today. I would like to preface the following by expressing my deep grief and sorrow for those directly affected by COVID-19. Sadly, I do know some that have lost their lives. I also know of countless others that have been utterly destabilized by the crisis. This morning, I wish to share some of what I'm learning about personal and spiritual liberation based on my experience living through the crisis as a parent and educator. If anything, this crisis has given me pause to reflect deeper on the meaning of life without the productivity hamster wheel I have felt trapped in for many years. This crisis has caused me to let go of the myth of perfection. A side note, I could write an entire rant about Trump's call for states to, all caps, liberate themselves, but that would defeat the purpose of my message. I encourage you all to seek areas where we can shrink and one day overcome polarization. Over the past week, I've been reflecting on parenting and teaching during the pandemic through a lens of liberation. At face value, any parent or teacher might likely laugh in my face. Liberation? Ha! We have lived for over a month with ever increasing constraints, with varying degrees of fear regarding normal, everyday activities, such as going to the grocery store. Well, quarantined in our homes with the same people 24/7, even if it is our loved ones, nerves are bound to flare. One day a few weeks back, I had to explain to my daughter that we couldn't go to the playground, even though the swings seemed to taunt us by swaying empty in the breeze. Though time is more abundant now more than ever, it seems as though I have not a moment to myself. I am a short order cook who also now does laundry nonstop in between Zoom meetings and lesson planning. And how is my daughter making so much laundry anyway? When I finally sit down to create meaningful lesson plans or to work on professional development or to answer an email from my exploding inbox about whether or not an assignment should be double-spaced, I remember that the online learning platform my daughter is using for the day goes offline after school hours, or that I'm burning an omelet, or that I need to shower now, or I will lose the opportunity forever for the day. Though I made the choice to become a single parent and take full responsibility for my actions, the circumstances of the pandemic caused me, at times, to feel like I am in this alone. Much of the time, liberation seems an impossibility in my mind. Can we seek liberation in a sense, right here, right now? I know it is possible. It's really hard work. It requires making space, striving towards diligent practice, and engaging in deep reflection to slowly shift our perspective. Something I've learned throughout this crisis is that to achieve a sense of liberation is to accept that none of us know what is going to happen. And while this is scary and unsettling, this uncertainty is a fact of life. This uncertainty was among us before the pandemic and will remain forever after. Accepting that none of us know connects us. We are in this together. Though I am isolated in my house with only my 6-year-old daughter and a newly adopted dog, I am not alone. There is no perfect way of getting through this because this pandemic and our current way of life is unprecedented. I'm finding, though, that I have choices to make every day. And one pivotal choice is to discard the idea that I can be a perfect parent or a perfect teacher. What I know is that I don't know. I think achieving a sense of liberation throughout this crisis also requires all of us to foster a beginner's mind. As Suzuki Roshi said, a beginner's mind is wide open and questioning. An expert's mind is closed. Moving forward, we need our minds wide open and questioning. I don't know about you, but I don't wish to return to the way things were 5 months ago. I feel strongly that we need to move away from polarization, first in our personal lives. Through this brokenness, I think we have the opportunity to create a wholeness that could not have been created otherwise. I have already witnessed the greatness of humanity with people rising to the occasion to help one another through this crisis. In her book, Welcoming the Unwelcome, Pema Chodron introduces a chapter on overcoming polarization with the following, quote, "The time we live in is a fertile ground for training and being open-minded and open-hearted. If we can learn to hold this falling apartness without polarizing and without becoming fundamentalist, then whatever we do today will have a positive effect on the future," end quote. I'll admit, when Governor DeWine announced the first round of school closings on March 12th, I was both relieved and freaking out. Relieved because I could stay home and enjoy an abundance of time with my daughter. Freaking out because I had no idea how to continue teaching my high school students from home. We had made so much progress in working with minimizing polarization and practicing civil dialogue. With the fact that over half of my students lack a strong internet connection, I felt all of these gains would be lost. First, to address my freak out about perfection. Like many parents, I feel the pressure, mostly internal, to be the perfect parent. During the initial week of school closures, I saw this handy color-coded time schedule floating around social media. Some of you may have seen it. It was titled COVID-19 Daily Schedule. Kudos to anyone out there who is making this schedule happen. The schedule magically streamlines the day into 1 to 2 hour increments for activities such as wake up, which is before 9 a.m., morning walk, yoga if raining, academic time, creative time, lunch, only 30 minutes, chore time, also only 30 minutes, quiet time, more academic time, afternoon fresh air, dinner, free time, and finally bedtime. Okay, this schedule genuinely seems like a great idea, and children do thrive on routine. But honestly, this schedule awakened my deepest fears of inadequacy and imperfection. I spent hours and days back on the hamster wheel. I felt like all of my actions were failures. Still, I soldiered on. I tried a version of this schedule for exactly 2 days, and then the wheels came off. Shortly into academic time, on the 3rd day, my daughter hit a wall, and I could sense that she was anxious and unsettled. Then I realized that I was anxious and unsettled because I wasn't following the COVID-19 daily schedule to a T, and as a result was probably going to be voted worst parent of the year because my cousin was doing this with her kids, and she even found time to post her smiling and cooperative children posed at makeshift desks in front of a whiteboard with the COVID-19 daily schedule blazing colorfully in the background. Then, as I was trying to plot out my next move, since the schedule was turning into a disaster, my daughter looked at me with a fierce grimace and screamed at the top of her lungs that I was the worst mom ever, and stormed off to her room. Moments later, her small arm reached out to tape a "keep out" sign on her bedroom door. At this moment, I felt like the ultimate failure. I wept openly for a few moments, and then somehow remembered a passage from a Sharon Salzberg book. In the passage, she's talking about the process of metta, loving kindness. She states, quote, "I have thought of this practice as being rather like holding in my hand a fragile, precious object made of glass. If I were to grasp it too tightly, it would shatter and break. If I were to get too lazy and negligent, it would fall from my hand and break. Connect the object gently with awareness. And just that way you can connect to or cherish each metaphase. Rather than the metaphase, I imagine my daughter as this precious object and realize that by clinging so tightly to this COVID-19 daily schedule, I was causing her to break. I was modeling an unhealthy coping mechanism, which says that when we are experiencing uncertainty or loss, that we should get on the hamster wheel and plow right through it with productivity. The last thing my child or any child, including my students, need right now is this unnecessary pressure. They have so much to carry with them. What they need from us is empathy and compassion. What they need for us is to make space for them. As Salzberg says, to connect gently with awareness. Before I close, I want to speak briefly about my mention of overcoming polarization. As an educator working with a teenage population, my days are rife with polarization. Developmentally, many of my students are stuck in big ego and can only see through this lens of us and them. Prior to the school closure, I was at the end of my rope with this mentality. The students could sense this and were egging me on by leaving notes about Trump 2020 and writing essays in which they wanted to debate the merits of Trump's presidency, minus credible sources and logical reasoning. Some mimicked our president and called coronavirus a hoax brought on by the libtards. This blinding ignorance drove me nearly mad. But I ask myself, how valuable am I as a human, a parent, a teacher, if I cling to these polarizing thoughts and ideas? Through a strong meditation practice and much personal reflection, I strive to know my students beyond this artificial lens. I strive to see them as the divine spirits that they are. Though I cannot change the societal and political structure overnight, this decade, or perhaps sadly, even in my lifetime, I can make choices that do make a positive impact in the here and now. I share my story with you to encourage you to see beyond an all or nothing approach to living through this crisis. I share my story with you to offer you active hope. I share my story with you to remind you that we are all flawed and imperfect, yet within us all is the spark of the divine. All of this makes us human and interconnected. I will end with a beautiful quote from Rainer Maria Rilke. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. An excerpt from the diary of Anne Frank. Peter and I have both spent our contemplative years in the annex. We often discuss the future, the past, and the present, but as I've already told you, I miss the real thing, and yet I know it exists. Is it because I haven't been outdoors for so long that I've become so smitten with nature? I remember a time when a magnificent blue sky, chirping birds, moonlight, and budding blossoms wouldn't have captivated me. Things have changed since I came here. One night during the Pentecost holiday, for instance, when it was so hot, I struggled to keep my eyes open until 11:30 so I could get a good look at the moon. All on my own for once. Alas, my sacrifice was in vain, since there was too much glare and I couldn't risk opening a window. Another time, several months ago, I happened to be upstairs one night when the window was open. I didn't go back down until it had to be closed again. The dark, rainy evening, the wind, the racing clouds had me spellbound. It was the first time in a year and a half that I'd seen the night face to face. After that evening, my longing to see it again was even greater than my fear of burglars, a dark rat-infested house, or robberies. I went downstairs all by myself and looked out the windows in the kitchen and private office. Many people think nature is beautiful. Many people sleep from time to time under the starry sky, and many people in hospitals and prisons long for the day when they'll be free to enjoy what nature has to offer. But few are as isolated and cut off as we are from the joys of nature, which can be shared by rich and poor alike. It's not just my imagination. Looking at the sky, the clouds, the moon, and the stars really does make me feel calm and hopeful. It's much better medicine than valerian or bromide. Nature makes me feel humble and ready to face every blow with courage. As luck would have it, I'm only able, except for a few rare occasions, to view nature through dusty curtains tacked over dirt-caked windows. It takes the pleasure out of looking. Nature is the one thing for which there is no substitute.
In some ways, we have never lived through anything like this before. In other ways, we have been here before. We have done this before. We have felt the weight of history on our backs because this is a historic moment. This is a moment that will redefine and shape the course of our lives. And sometimes it is useful to play the historian, to compare and contrast the other major historical events, times when we have been forced into hiding, forced into our homes, times when we have felt moments of pure and unadulterated panic and fear, times where we have felt the obstacles we faced were insurmountable and faced them anyway. I am reminded of Exodus. As soon as I knew the theme for this month was liberation, I thought of Exodus, that story of slavery and liberation from bondage, one of the ancient ones, one for the ages. I have always been particularly drawn to the story of Moses, and as Jewish people around the country gathered together for virtual Seders this recent Passover, I was reminded of a pivotal moment in the story during the last plague. Exodus 12:22-23 dictates Moses' instructions to the Israelites. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood of the basin, and put some of the blood on the top and both sides of the doorframe. None of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on top and sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. The Bible is not full of literary flourishes. There is not a lot of room within these verses for introspection. As a work of literature, I have always found it lacking in this way. I have always wanted to go beyond the story and to the characters underneath it to understand how they felt about the miracles and turmoils happening around them. Exodus does not tell us how these families felt, huddling in their homes as a great plague swept around them. But we can imagine. The Lord, through Moses, promised that no one who followed his instructions would be struck down, but can't you just imagine the people wondered? How afraid they must have been, gathered around their kitchen table, knowing that something great in the old sense great in the way that God is great, not good, but magnificent and mighty, was happening just outside their door. I think of Anne Frank, sequestered in an attic. I think of friends on Facebook, one of whom is growing strawberries and texting me with updates every so often about the planting and growing process. How we cling to the nature outside our doors and windows, and how fortunate we are to still be able to indulge in that nature, to take a trip to the park even if we have to keep 6 feet of distance away from everyone else. We have been here before, we will be here again, and yet we will have never been anywhere like this before. And we hope for the sake of our children and our children's children that we will never be anywhere like this again. When I think of liberation, I think of two kinds, personal and political. When I think of liberation in the time of Corona, I think of rent strikes and Amazon warehouse workers not being allowed to take sick leaves. I think of essential workers in grocery stores not being paid a living wage, and how we must not allow ourselves to go back to the way things were before. And I think at the same time how we long for a sense of normalcy, anything normal we can cling to, even those of us who reject a sense of normal in favor of something revolutionary. I saw a meme on Facebook recently. It said, "When I said I wanted to live through something historical, this isn't what I meant. It was supposed to be space travel. It was supposed to be rocket ships and flying cars. The revolution of tomorrow always seems exciting and new, but we are faced with the banality and blandness of our day-to-day. The truth, our day-to-day is hard, and many of us are barely functioning." When I think of liberation, I think of two kinds, personal and political. We live in changing times, and I think one of the most powerful things we can do for ourselves right now is to indulge in a little self-care. It's an old and ancient curse. May you live in interesting times. We have no shortage of those right now. And I know we're all longing for things to just seem a little bit more normal. Maybe things will never be normal again. There are things we just don't know. There are things we just can't know. In this time, let us remember the beauty of nature and the beauty of our relationships with each other. We have never faced anything like this before, but we have faced the unknown before, and we have survived. Let us thrive in community, not wilt in silence. Please pray with me. Let us remember the words of Anne Frank. "And in the evening, when I lie in bed and end my prayers with the words, 'I thank you, God, for all that is good and dear and beautiful,' I am filled with joy." In these interesting times, let us find joy. In these ever-shifting waters, let us find a moment of peace. Let us extol the virtues of personal as well as political liberation. Let us be gentle with ourselves and learn to ease the load on our shoulders. None of us are alone, and we can carry this weight together. Amen.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we keep in our hearts until we meet again.
As we depart, please remember the one great fact. You are loved and never truly alone. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're going to do a bit of a talk back. So if anyone has questions or comments, now is the time.